Well, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honour to be and pleasure to be back at WION's Global Summit, and congratulations to the team for making such a great, creating such a great gathering and discussing such hot topics. Now, of course, the topic of climate change is very much on the agenda across the world with news organizations. I heard a story that the US President Donald Trump was looking for advice, looking for good advice. And he'd heard or noticed that the British government runs fairly efficiently. So while on a trip to the UK, he was visiting with the Queen, and he said, Your Majesty, I have to ask you, how does your government run so efficiently? Could you give me some tip? She said, look, the most important thing is you need good, intelligent people around you. He said, well, how do I know that they're really intelligent? She said, I'll show this. And she called over Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. She said, you have to ask them riddles. Watch this. She said, Mr. Johnson, your mother and your father had a child. It wasn't your brother and it wasn't your sister. Who was it? And Boris Johnson said, well, that was me, of course. Very good. So Trump smiles. It's very good. Okay. She said, see, you just asked them a riddle. So he gets back to the USA and he calls Mike Pence, his vice president. He says, Mike, I've got to ask you a riddle. And Mike Pence says, sure. He says, your mother and your father had a child. It wasn't your brother. It wasn't your sister. Who was it? Pence said, I'm not really sure. Let me get back to you. So Pence goes off. He asks all his advisors, what do I do? This, mother and father, who's it? No one could answer. Then he happened to be in the gents' room, and Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, walked in. And he said, Mike, I've got a question for you. Your mother and your father had a child. It wasn't your brother. It wasn't your sister. Who was it? And Mike Pompeo says, well, easy. That was me, of course. So Pence smiles to himself. He goes back to President Trump. He says, ask me that riddle again. And President Trump says, okay, so your mother and your father had a child. It wasn't your brother. It wasn't your sister. Who was it? And Mike Pence says, easy. It was Mike Pompeo. And Trump says, you idiot, it's Boris Johnson. So sometimes getting intelligent answers is very difficult when it comes to climate change. Equally challenging, as you can tell. For years, scientists have warned about the damage that human neglect and abuse is doing to our planet, and slowly, and perhaps not surely, there's been a broad and global recognition for the need to do something before it's too late. So let's not point fingers, but it's certainly not very helpful when voices in authority deny that there's any issue to be concerned about, because to whatever degree, pardon the pun, there is definitely something to be concerned about when it comes to global temperatures with all these issues that we've been discussing that Balki introduced too. It seems we're more inclined to listen to the impassioned pleas of a teenage girl than highly educated men and women in lab coats spouting facts and figures. So the title of this session is, perhaps aptly, At the Frontline of Climate Change, Climate Wake-Up Call and Signals of Hope. And we have a distinguished panel that was introduced to you just a moment ago to discuss this. So I'm going to get straight to some questions. And Your Excellency, I want to welcome you. And I'm going to ask each of you a question, starting with you. How worried should we, as individuals, be about climate change? And have we reached perhaps the point where it's actually now irreparable? Please, I'll start with you. Yeah.
For anyone that is following the news, the world news around what's happening climate-wise, should know that climate change is already happening big times. And I myself, I come from Greenland, and I flew down from Greenland yesterday from -40 to this wonderful temperature here. First of all, thank you for having me here. And thank you. And I represent a population of 56,000 people. It's a very, very small population that have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years. We are living in Greenland where the ice cap is more than 3 kilometers thick, 2.2 million square kilometer. It's the biggest ice mass in the Nordic Hemisphere, the biggest ice mass after Antarctica. I see myself right out through my window, right through everywhere, that the ice cap is melting all year round. Normally, it would be melting like in summer temperatures of June till October. Now, it's melting ever as strong as it is before. And the icebergs are massive, and they're melting crazy, and the temperatures are rising in Greenland. Last summer, we came up to all the way to 20 degrees Celsius. That is unheard before. and that results in the Greenland ice cap melting more than 5 times more than the scientists predicted just for about a couple of years ago. So this is serious matters, and Greenland ice cap right now is probably one of the most well-monitored location in the world to figure out how the ice cap is traveling and how fast it's melting. And I must say that because of the ice cap, the seriousness about it's not just the weather, it is also changing the world politics. It is changing our perception of how we should live, and it is changing our economy, it's changing our perception of how the globe is functioning. So I think the climate change as it is seen, it is changing us in all matters.
Thank you, Ms. Hammond. Now, the reason I phrased it, why should we as individuals be worried, is because I grew up, I'm turning 58. I grew up in a time where, growing up in Britain, people didn't think twice about littering. Now, if I see someone throw something on the floor, I feel very angry. I was growing up in a generation we had no real clue about climate change, or no concern, no suggestions. I mean, if we got the sun shining in Britain in the summer, we were pleasantly surprised. It didn't happen very often. But now it's got to the stage where I think there's much more awareness, and it seems there is a younger generation leading the charge. And Vanessa, I'm glad to have you here as well. It seems that there's a generation coming up now. I have a daughter who's turning 14, a generation that's coming up that is far more aware and don't carry the baggage of my generations and a couple of generations around me where we really didn't have a clue of what was going on. Tell me, from the younger person's perspective, you're in your early 20s, how you see the seriousness of the matter.
Thank you so much for having me. The issue of climate change needs to get all of us worried, not just the young people, because we see mainly the young people going out there demanding for action. It's like we are the only ones who are seeing the impacts. When you look around the world, you see devastating impacts of climate change. For example, I'll start with India. Last year, the temperatures rose up to 50.6 degrees and caused heat waves all over India. I'm certain you heard about the water stress in Chennai that left many people struggling to get just a drop of water for survival. Personally, I come from Uganda, that's in Africa, where I've also seen the impacts of climate change. Most of the people in my community and Africa at large, and I guess in most Asian countries, most of the people depend on agriculture for their survival. As we sit here comfortably, not all of us here depend on the agriculture, but yet the food that you eat is prepared by those who are at the front lines of the climate crisis. When these people are affected by the floods that come about by the increasing sea level rises, they lose everything. They lose their hopes and dreams for survival on this planet. Most of them just survive on their subsistence farming. They're left with nothing to feed their children. They're left with nothing for their families. Especially in most families where the women have to do everything to provide food on the table. I'm talking about the people who live in rural communities who are at the front lines of the climate crisis. We who are seated here comfortably will only be affected by the prices. But of course, you have the money to buy the food regardless of how expensive it is. But then they have to work hard to try and get something for their children, to get food for their families. That is why everyone is needed in the fight against the climate crisis. It affects different people from different parts of the world. We are seeing the wildfires in Australia, California. We've seen the floods in Jakarta. We've seen all these disasters. What else do we need? We need to stop at the words. We need to stop at the promises and do the action. all of us need to be worried about the future because it is uncertain. If you cannot do it for me, then do it for your children. If you cannot do it for the young people in Asia or the young people all over the world, do it for your grandchildren. And if you can't do it for yourself, at least do it for your conscience.
Vanessa, thank you very much. Interesting you said that, you mentioned the various conditions that we're encountering around the world. I've been in the news business over 35 years, and at the early stages we never associated any of the disasters that we were reporting on to be connected with climate change. That's something that's come up more. I'm going to bring in Professor James Terry here. And Professor, the reason I asked from an individual perspective is because individual thought is guided by what we consider to be valid information. And I wonder how it frustrates you as someone who works in the environmental sciences to hear sometimes a lack of leadership. We have a US president who's in denial. We have scientists giving evidence as well, but then there's people who are often just coming up with counter-arguments. How frustrating do you find that?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to be here. It can be frustrating, but as a scientist, of course, we understand that data is always changing. So I can understand that sometimes there might be some skepticism towards science, but that's because the nature of science is such that we have new methods, we have new techniques, we have new tools at our disposal, we have new modelling that didn't exist 1, 2 or 3 decades ago. So what that means is that there's always going to be change in information that's given. There's always going to be refinement in the kinds of data that can be provided. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't act. Your question originally was, should we feel concerned as individuals? Well, of course, we should if we have compassion for our fellow man. I'm privileged and fortunate to have spent a large part of my career as an academic, but not based where I grew up in the United Kingdom, but in the Pacific Islands. I spent 12 years at the University of the South Pacific, which is an island nation university covering 12 different island nations spread across a huge area of the South Pacific. And people there, of course, are facing very real threats in various different forms. The islands in the South Pacific are not all the same. They vary. There are tall volcanic islands, there are low-lying atolls, and the kinds of vulnerabilities that people will experience might be different according to where you live. Now, the kinds of changes that people are experiencing will be, first of all, long-term slow changes, such as sea level rise and changing ocean temperatures, but also things like stress on groundwater, stress on available land, loss of coastlines, retreat of shorelines. And of course, if you live in a small island, then your available resources are perhaps limited. So I think, we should all be concerned with making sure that whatever position we find ourselves in, we regard our neighbours, we regard those that might be in very more serious situations than ourselves, and take appropriate action. There are 2 kinds of action that can be taken. Of course, there is mitigation, which means trying to reduce the causes of climate change. But then there's also adaptation, and adaptation means dealing with the consequences. Some countries, of course, can't do much in terms of global mitigation, and they're forced to adapt. We should reach out to make sure that the science gives correct information, to make sure that our decision-making is based on up-to-date information, and not to ignore the plight of people who might be in a situation where they're going to have to act very quickly and very soon to combat some of the worst effects.
Professor, thank you. Alika Hammond, as I bring you in for a response, I also want to point out, Greenland, of course, is a country where mitigation and adaptation are going to be affected by a small population, so there's not much you can do in terms of mitigation. But you have indicated that even in your lifetime, you're seeing the need for adaptation because a large part of the population is Inuit and they're very in tune with nature and the conditions. They're having to adapt quite quickly, aren't they?
We are still living very much traditional today in terms of using land and sea ice. Both my brothers are professional hunters. They're out on the sea ice every single day to bring in the food that we have to eat, but also to sell one of the best quality fish around the world. So we are out on the sea ice every single day. We notice right now, even though Greenland is very big, it's the biggest island of the world. And we are living all around Greenland, like 20 different places of towns that we are staying at. And adaptation is not something that you have to wait for others to start. Adaptation towards climate change, Greenland has been working on that for years. 75% of our electricity that we produce are coming from clean energy, from the lakes that are being created by the ice melting. And we are planning on becoming 100% produced on renewable energy by year 2030. We are one of the world leading in adaptation to the new opportunities that our country is giving us. But at the same time, adaptation is not just on the energy side. The world is also noticing that the poles, the North Pole region is changing. The ice retrieving means that your ability to use it as a new freight route in the coming years is of great economic interest for the outside world. And because of that, China has announced the North Pole region to be one of the most important Silk Roads in the coming years to see. NATO notices that, and Russia is also taking advantage of it and also creating their own new air bases, not even 1,000 kilometers further away than Greenland. That means the North Pole region is becoming another area for military interest around the world. And that is, so to speak, as they use it, military adaptation to the new world. But that is creating a new threat for the Arctic region, because many of these countries are talking about the Arctic as if there are no people and no governments and no parliaments. But they are people with their own governments and parliaments and have their rights to their own land. So I think adaptation is also very much on policy, how you see the world, and that how you are dealing with the countries around the world, not only on climate-wise, but also because of the climate consequences, what is happening between the nations and the interests around the world.
It's interesting you mentioned the geomilitary impact that's taken place. You know, Vanessa, when I introduced you, the news business loves catchphrases, and I described you as an activist. It's a term also used for Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish teenager who's also very much in the limelight with this. How do you feel about the term activist? Shouldn't we all be activists now?
Earth does not just belong to us, the young people. It belongs to everyone. Earth is our home and it's our responsibility. So everyone is needed as an activist because we are all benefiting from what Earth provides for us.
But in terms of, you know, it's very much younger people who are in the forefront now. Why do you think the world is more keen to listen to young people than anyone else? What do you think really has triggered this interest in what the young voice says?
Well, the future belongs to the young people, and this is something that hasn't happened for quite a long time, for young people to rise up together, over 5 million young people to demand for action, and not to just demand, but to be focused and determined on the demands that they're setting on their governments. I think this is what has really made the movement be known in different parts of the world, and that is what has attracted different young people to join the movement, because when they realize that their future is at stake, then they have to fight for it. I mean, as young people, we have dreams, we have hopes, we've gone to school, we have things that we hope to achieve, but then we're not sure if we'll be able to enjoy all those things or achieve the things that we want with a future that is so uncertain. So we are trying to clean up the mess that was created by those who have already lived half of their lives.
It's interesting you raise that. To what extent do you blame previous generations? To what extent does it make you angry? We hear Greta quite impassioned in her speeches. She has a particular way of speaking, but to what degree do you blame past generations? How much are we responsible?
Well, the older generations have taken decisions that have put the future of the people coming later on, or the people that are living right now, at stake. They have taken up decisions and carried out activities, for example, investments in the fossil fuel industry, that have put us at stake. They have chosen profits over the planet. They have chosen profits over the lives of the people in this world. That is why we are angry. That is why we are demanding for action. And that is why we want change. Because I believe that before all these developments that brought about climate change and the climate crisis, people were still living, but they were able to adjust and transition to this new system. So what we are demanding for is a more sustainable path to development. We are not against development, but we believe that there is a path to development that is more sustainable, and that's what we want. I mean, we want to try and live our lives, we want to survive, we want to achieve very many things.
So, Professor, what Vanessa is referring to is, of course, a transition from the negative impact you've had through fossil fuels and kind of lack of consideration for the environment. How can that transition be realistically achieved? From a scientific perspective, it can't change overnight, can it? So we have to some degree, accept there has to be a transition. At what pace?
That's, of course, very difficult to answer. You know, it depends very much on where you are, on how your economy is developing, and, you know, each country's own individual aspirations. I mean, we all need to have ambition to assist in, you know, in the global frameworks that exist in terms of, you know, tackling these kinds of issues. You know, some countries, for example, around the South China Sea, find themselves facing extreme, you know, problems in the not too distant future. There are very large cities, megacities, that exist on deltas. For example, Bangkok has a population of 10 million people, you know, living on the Chao Phraya Delta, just a metre above sea level. You have the Brahmaputra Delta, you have the Irrawaddy in Myanmar. You know, around the world there will be people who are facing greater risk, and they will feel as though there's much more urgency. I think the problem is that many of us don't feel that same urgency if we're living in fairly comfortable societies where you don't on a daily basis have to face these kinds of challenges. But those challenges will come. You know, as I said before, there are the long-term slow changes that we should expect. But also, one of the knock-on effects is likely to be perhaps increasing numbers of natural hazards that have severe impacts leading to global scale disasters. You know, we cannot link any individual particular event, such as a hurricane or a typhoon or a wildfire, overall to climate change, but it's certainly true that we should anticipate in the future seeing more of these kinds of extreme events. Those are the things which really have huge impacts on economies around the world, in particular regions, especially for coastal populations. You know, when you are a megacity and you're living near to sea level, your resources, your development, your infrastructure, your tourism is facing these kinds of events, these extreme events. Well, of course, the transition is going to need to be quicker and sooner rather than later. You know, there are various options that can be taken, and it's not all about the mitigation, as we heard from Her Excellency. The adaptation needs to be culturally sensitive. You know, I think part of the problem is that often in the past, scientists have come into particular regions and tried to tell local communities, you know, what might be good for them. I think those days are gone. I think modern science needs to make sure that it embraces traditional environmental knowledge. That can be extremely important, to make sure that you're listening to the stakeholders, and this is called participatory research, to make sure that everybody's engaged so that the solutions that are reached are always acceptable to the people who have to implement them. It's no good scientists coming along and saying, well, this is the technique or the method or the adaptation we think is good for you, without having people at the grassroots levels engaged at all parts of the discussion.
I'm going to swing around to solutions again in just a moment, but I'm going to throw this out there, Malika Hammond, and to you as well, Vanessa. It's interesting that the strongest voices, to some degree, seem to be coming from women. I was brought up by my mother, essentially, and learned to respect, where women can stand on things. And South Asia's proved with leadership that women have been very strong leaders. I wonder, is this something that's quite significant, that leadership is coming a lot more from women when it comes to climate change awareness?
Well, I don't know how it is in the other countries, but in Greenland, the women have always been very strong. We represent women approximately. We are 50-50 in our parliament, 50% men, 50% women, approximately there. We don't even have to do extra for women. We want to try to do extra for our men, because many of our men are not doing strong enough as the women are doing in the society. If you see the level of educatedness, if you see the level of important posts around the society, the women are leading very, very strongly ahead than the men. So we would like to do more for our men.
Thank you.
And comparing to regarding the climate change, and I think the adaptation and climate change and awareness is not a question of gender. It is a question of leadership in the country, leadership being able to see what is best for your country, but also at the same time see what's best for the world. And I think that the Inuit people, as I'm representing, we have always been living by the ice, with the ice. We want the ice. We don't want the ice to disappear. And right now, we see that our men are telling us that the sea ice is thinning very, very strongly. And if the sea ice is thinning strongly, that means our livelihood is in danger. So it's very important that we talk about climate change at all levels, not only within the policy, but also in the whole society, especially with our children, because they are the ones that are going to carry out the negative consequences if we, as decision makers today, haven't taken our job seriously.
Vanessa, I want to get a young woman's perspective. Again, is it, in your opinion, or have you seen that there's more leadership coming from young women? And again, women in the community. I mean, we say Mother Nature, for example. I'm not sure if that has an impact, but what's your view?
Yeah, in regards to climate change, women stand out as the strongest voice because they are most affected by the impacts of the climate crisis. For example, in most communities, most families around the world, it is women that put food on the table. Through their hard work, they go to their gardens, they go to their farms, they carry out the crop production. But when these disasters happen, for example, flooding or droughts, and these crops are affected, it is this woman's hard work that has been put to zero. So they have to do everything they can to restore what has been lost, so that they can provide for their children. When there is water stress, I saw the photos of the Chennai water stress. Women were the most people carrying buckets and jerrycans, trying to get some water for their families. That is why they stand out loudest and demand for action, because these things affect them the most. When hurricanes occur and people's homes are destroyed, they are single mothers. They are displaced and they are left homeless without where to stay. And this also increases the levels of sexual violence against these women, because they have to sleep on the streets with their children. Last year, I also read an article that was talking about girls being given up as brides as a result of climate change. This is because when families lose everything, they try as much as possible to reduce on the number of the children at home. And in that, they make very heartbreaking decisions and give up the girl child for marriage, so that they can reduce on the number of the people in their family. So when you look at all these things, you realize that climate change really affects women the most, and that is why they're speaking out the most. In most communities, women are not allowed to climb trees, But we know that when there is a flood, the first adaptation method to surviving the flood is climbing a tree. So most of them will die because they cannot climb the tree. Most women are found pregnant during these disasters, so they cannot easily survive. So personally, I can say if one man or two men die during a climate disaster, I believe that 6 women die in that same climate disaster. That is why we stand out the most and demand for action.
So as we start wrapping up, I'm going to get back to you, Professor, and ask about something you touched on, is solutions. What danger is there, do you think, that the news agenda often just shifts very quickly, that climate change will be, dare I say, a passing fad?
Well, look, first of all, am I allowed to comment on the last question?
Oh, please, absolutely.
The role of women in science, extremely important. It has to be nurtured, it has to be encouraged, there has to be, funding behind this. My previous position at the National University of Singapore, where I was in the geography department, our geography and environmental program had more than 60% women enrolled. So that shows you that in the future it's going to be a greater number of women in terms of Southeast Asia expertise. Here at Zayed University, this is a women's progressive university which was set up for improving the human capital, female human capital in science. And I think that that's absolutely fantastic. It's wonderful to see. At the moment, we have students who have had placements in senior positions in environmental protection agencies, in the space program, in energy and water sectors in Dubai, and that is, I think, the way forward. And I think the UAE is a beacon in terms of women's role in science. To get back to your other question, will climate change be a fad? I don't think it will. It's here to stay. Certainly there are shifts in direction. Certainly we have to address new concerns. When I was a child at school in the 1970s, the big theme was desertification. This was the topic that was on everybody's lips. Probably it's fair to say that much of the problems to do with desertification were climate related at that time, in addition to growing populations and pressure for agriculture and so on. But, climates have always been changing. We must remember that in the Earth's 4.5 billion year history, there's never been a period when the Earth's climate has been stable, and that needs to be recognised. What's different about the modern era is that the human contribution, the anthropogenic contribution, is different. This is something which is new, and the more humans there are on the planet, the more the impact we are going to have, and therefore this cannot be something which is just going to disappear.
So, following with the theme that CEO Sudhir mentioned at the beginning, let's have some solutions. One minute from each of you on suggestions to the people in this room on what they can do to be an active player in creating change as an individual. I'll start with you, Professor, and then I'll work back to you, all of you.
Individuals, well, I think we just have to make sure that we're behind our own national programs in terms of funding. Often new solutions are trial and error. You have to, first of all, give them a fair attempt, and we learn by our mistakes. We have science, which helps to give possible ideas about how we can address various issues, but the kinds of responses won't be the same everywhere around the world. What we have to do is to make sure that we are behind science, make sure that science is well funded, and make sure that any new solutions, are given a fair go first of all before we criticise.
Okay. Vanessa, a recommendation to the people in this room, what would you say? Just 1 minute.
People need to stop running away from the conversation of climate change. Many people find it very uncomfortable to talk about climate change, so they need to stop that because it affects all of us. And then there are people who act interested in learning about climate change, but when we offer the solutions, they're not willing to take them up. So we need to embrace the conversation of climate change, and we need to stand together to demand for action and to also take the action. And then lastly, we need to use our voices, because our voices are powerful, and I personally believe that they can cause change in whatever sphere of life.
All right. Ms. Hammond.
I think when we talk about climate change, the most important word in this one is the change. I think it requires for us To adapt to the climate change requires that we change how we think, change how we do our policy, and change how we do talk about climate, change in how we raise our children for adaptation. The biggest change is within ourselves, in ourselves, to adapt to the climate change. So I think that a lot of people, they want change, but they don't want to change at home. It requires, there's no in-between. It is very important that you have a political leadership that also takes this change seriously. Investments for renewable energy is very costly, but trust me, it is the only way ahead, and you cannot postpone it. It requires a very strong leadership to invest in that, because this is an investment that's to the better change.
Thank you. So, ladies and gents, the conversation obviously doesn't end, and each of you has a role to play. A big round, warm round of applause for our panelists, please. Thank you.